Morning, everybody. It is a beautiful day today, and today we are talking about the Holy Week.
Hey man, how are you doing? Good. Hey, I've had some ideas just tumbling around my head, and especially this morning it hit me. I think I've got this great idea, and I need someone to video it. Well, let me start here. The purpose that we exist for is exactly why Jesus came, is to seek and to save the lost. And so the lost in this community are close to our hearts. We pray for them, and we also think exactly what we need to do to be reaching. Here in the next 3 months, we want to reach, to raise $250,000. And I know that with this $250,000, we will be able to reach the lost. With this $250,000, I will be purchasing a red Ferrari. And it's going to be wonderful. The people of this community.
So on Monday, we find Jesus in Jerusalem with his disciples. And they walk into a temple, and what they find there utterly shocks them. And this is because the temple's been allowed to be turned into a marketplace. And not a marketplace to further the kingdom or to further the ministry of the temple, but rather a marketplace used for people to get rich. So Jesus comes in, and rightfully so, he's upset. He's big mad. And he starts flipping tables. Now, to put this in perspective a little bit, this is the equivalent of a guy coming into your office or your workplace and ripping up your paycheck and clearing your desk off, flipping your desk. So these people were just as shocked as Jesus was. And right after this, we find that Jesus is getting questioned, and deeply questioned, by the temple leaders, by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they are trying to trap him. And Jesus, knowing this, is, answering these questions perfectly. And one of the questions that they ask him is, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus, knowing that they're trying to trap him, answers like this. There's actually 2 greatest commandments. Love your God with all your heart and love your neighbor. Now, these words give us some motivation and some understanding to why Jesus was so upset, but it also gives us some understanding on how the church should operate. Now, in the past, in history, throughout history, we've seen people exploit the church and make the church about them, or make the church about a money scheme and trying to get rich off of it. But here, Jesus is saying that it's about him. It's about his relationship with us. It's about us worshiping him and praising him, and us outreaching to other people and spreading his word to people who don't know it.
All right, so after Jesus leaves the temple, he looks back at the buildings and what he just came out of. He says to his disciples, you see all this? It's not going to be here much longer. It's going to be destroyed. Man, why isn't this working? Man, I wish it would work the first time. So, after he is done looking at the temple and says that they're going to be destroyed, further in on that Tuesday, he just walks straight up to the Mount of Olives without saying a word. This is over a half mile from where they were at that point, without saying a word. And he gets up there, and the disciples, of course, start asking a bunch of questions, and he stops them dead in their tracks. And he looks back at Jerusalem, and he looks back at them, and he says, guys, things are about to get bad. False Christs, wars, natural disasters, famine, persecution, even people that we would call heretics or false Christs are going to come, and they are going to try to take over. This is all going to happen, and it's going to lead up to something much worse. And what he was talking about was the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This happened 40 years after he was here. Think about that. Jesus predicts in this discourse in Matthew 24 the destruction of Jerusalem, which happens 40 years after he leaves this earth. And honestly, a lot of it can be confusing, but think of it like a person or a spouse or a loved one preparing to leave this earth, and they are talking to their family or their children about what they need to do in order to survive. And I think the gist of it is all wrapped up in chapter 24, verses 12 through 14, where he says this: "And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel, the kingdom, will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." You see, Jesus, as he was preparing them for what was getting ready to take place later that week, and what was going to happen for the next 40 years, and then even after that, his focus was on that they would be steadfast in their faith, that their love would endure. But then it wouldn't just be about them, but that they would look at the people around them and they would preach this gospel. They would proclaim this to the people around them with the way that they lived their lives and what they said. You see, it wasn't just about them. It was about what his gospel was going to do for the entire world.
Dude, what are you doing?
So on Wednesday of the week before Jesus was crucified, we find him at the house of a man named Simon the leper, resting with the disciples. And as they're resting, we see a woman come and break a jar of expensive perfume and pour it over Jesus' head. And the disciples' reaction is a bit unexpected. They're beside themselves, criticizing this woman, saying, "This perfume could have been sold and the money given to the poor." And Jesus rebukes them and says, "No, this woman is right. She's bringing and honoring me in a time before I'm going to die," and even referencing his burial. And there's a couple of lessons, I think, that can be taken from this. We see, first of all, Jesus lift up the woman and her right action and right understanding of the situation. But more so, I think we can look at the reaction of the disciples, especially Judas, and take a warning. This judging mentality that they had leads Judas down a dark path, and it becomes the tipping point in which it leads him to betray Jesus. It says that after this, he goes and seeks out the religious leaders and asks them what they will give him in order to betray him, and begins looking for opportunities from then on. And I think the warning is that when we look at others and they're doing things from a right motivation, but we begin to criticize their actions, it's an indicator that we could be heading down a dangerous path. And so instead, I think the disciples' right reaction would have been to look at this woman and to see her honoring Jesus. And instead of criticizing her, to stop and say, how could we honor Jesus? And the same for us. If we see someone doing something we don't understand, but out of a right motivation, instead of criticizing the details of how they do it, maybe we ought to follow their example and come to the place of thinking, how might I honor Jesus in my own way?
All right, I'm Matt.
I'm Eli.
I'm Jared.
And this is The Last Lunch. Just so you know what it is, it's frozen character mac and cheese with Carolina Reaper pepper flakes in it.
I breathe. It's not even very good mac and cheese right now. I'm okay right now.
I breathe.
On Thursday, so much happened in the life of Jesus at the end of his life, right? We see that on Thursday they celebrate the Passover meal together. We see him go to the garden and spend time in prayer. We see Judas betray Jesus. And we see Peter's denial as the trial begins. But I want to take a moment and just focus on the Passover meal, right? Jesus knows the end of his life is coming. He knows that he's in the final few hours of his life. Instead of spending that time doing things that are fun or that would find pleasure in, he instead spends that time having that meal with his disciples. And more than that, he takes the place of a servant, and he gets down on his hands and knees and he washes the disciples' feet. His very last few hours on earth is not spent on him, is not spent on what he wants or he desires, but is spent showing love to his disciples. And guys, what blows my mind even more about that is that he washes all the disciples' feet, including Judas. Judas, he knew, was going to betray him. He knew that time was coming, and yet he still washed Judas's feet. I think in this short passage, we see Jesus display his love so perfectly. His love is for everyone, no matter if they're going to follow him or not. He loves you. He loves everyone. And he showed it by that Last Supper. He could have been doing things that were fun for him. He could have been hanging out, doing whatever he wanted, but instead he chose to serve and he chose to love. And that is what it means for us to follow Christ as well.
All right, this brings us to Friday. And on Friday, a lot takes place. Jesus is tried falsely by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's turned over to Pilate. He's beaten and flogged, and then he is crucified. He is mocked while he is on the cross, and he ultimately dies. And this is a day that we call Good Friday. Now, the world looks at this, especially a title like Good Friday, and they think, what is good about that? He's tried falsely. He is accused of a crime that he did not commit, or I should say he's punished for a crime that he did not commit, or at least commit falsely. And then he, by a coward governor, is sentenced to death. What could possibly be good about that? And it reminded me of a passage in 1 Corinthians. If you've been with us on Sunday mornings, Ronnie's been preaching through this book, and in the first chapter, Paul says some things that I think speak to this. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low in the world and even despised, and even things that are not, to bring nothing the things that are, so that no human might boast in the presence of God. You see, the world looks at this as foolish, and God knew that they would look at it this way. But for those that are in Christ, for those that have accepted this sacrifice as their own, that day is a Good Friday for us, because that is when our sin was atoned for on the cross. That is when Jesus took the punishment that we deserved upon himself when he had done nothing wrong. You see, the world looks at this as foolish, but we know that Sunday is coming.